How brittle and bruised was Palpatine's ego that such an event could cause this sort of response? It makes sense for the Empire to strike back in order to meet rebellion with further oppression. Palpatine appeared to take such acts of resistance to heart. For an unlovable man, a significant part of Palpatine appeared to want people to bow and suffer under him, and to do so willingly and with gratitude. If this was Palpatine's aim, then his reclusiveness did not help matters. In the core worlds, Palpatine remained an ongoing figure, even if he only ever made rare appearances in the Senate. But further out in the galaxy, beyond the mid-rim and on the outer rim, the Emperor himself was almost an irrelevance. He barely even existed as a symbol, replaced instead by stormtroopers, TIE fighters, and star destroyers. As peculiar as it sounds, there are serious questions over whether or not some people on these planets even knew what the Emperor looked like. While his declaration of empire was broadcast widely on the holonet, and, as a result, showed Palpatine's new physical form after his battle with the Jedi, elements of his old appearance still proliferated. The propaganda poster leadership, order, power that was displayed on multiple worlds, such as Naboo and Vardos, did not use the Emperor's current appearance, but instead reverted to how he had looked as Supreme Chancellor. Similar images were regularly displayed on the walkways of Coruscant, and they too showed a much younger version of Imperial Archives section, Imperial Security Bureau file, Aldani response briefing. 21 Imperial Archives section, Imperial Security Bureau file, Spellhouse Operation Imperial Archives section, Propaganda Material file, Leadership, Order, Power. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Palpatine, as did the Emperor's Museum on Coruscant, the docent in charge of that institution, would regularly take guests on tours through the exhibitions outlining Palpatine's rise from humble beginnings to becoming one of the heroes we need. There are also indications from within old Imperial records that, at times, Palpatine would use a filter on his hologram projections to appear as he once had, rather than how he currently did. The reason for this was ego. But again, it makes us wonder why Palpatine cared at all about what people thought of him when he was already Emperor. Maybe he realized the issues his current appearance caused and feared his mutilated visage would be interpreted as a sign of weakness, but I'm not convinced. Given Palpatine's ongoing arrogance, I think it is reasonable to suggest he wanted people to buy into the propaganda images for more personal reasons. Regardless, though, for the most important figure in the galaxy to have no clear visual recognition on some worlds is staggering, though interestingly, the previously mentioned busts of Palpatine currently available on Batuu depict his face after the injuries inflicted by the Jedi. There also exist further questions regarding what exactly Palpatine did with his time, having essentially become a malleable figure rather than something present in people's lives. His appearances in the Senate were so rare as to become notable events in themselves. His public appearances were even scarcer than that. He maintained a private box at the Grand Imperial Opera House, but it is unclear how often he visited. Other guests sometimes noted the appearance of the red-robed royal guards within the building, but that is not definitive proof that Palpatine himself was in attendance. It could just as easily have served his purposes to make people believe he moved around. Having become Senator Leia, Emperor Palpatine, Emperor He had relocated himself to the old Jedi Temple, rebranding it as the Imperial Palace so that he could rule the galaxy from the home of his defeated foes. He also had a small retreat in the countryside of Naboo, but whatever he did there is not clear. The building was stripped of all equipment and material before it could be explored by the New Republic following the planet's liberation. Having acquired all of this power, the Emperor did not seem inclined to directly wield it himself. or to ever interact with outsiders again. If he had no interest in seeing the lies and promises of prosperity come to pass, and he was not actively involved with the running of the empire, what was he doing? Sith Lord. It is possible that an additional assumption about Palpatine's long running plan has blinded us to an extra important element. The notion that Palpatine rose to power, then destroyed the Jedi Order and the Republic simply in order to become Emperor and rule the galaxy makes a great deal of sense, but it also suffers from the supposition that this form of recognizable power was all that Palpatine wanted. But this power was not eternal. Palpatine could sit upon the throne for decades, but eventually he would die and the empire would pass to another. It is here that we must understand the potential underlying element to his Sith studies. Palpatine did not simply want to rule the galaxy, he wanted to rule it forever. He had no interest in having a reign that expired at the end of his life, and he does not strike me as the sort of person who is interested in retirement or succession. Should we now perhaps be wondering if everything Palpatine did as Senator, Supreme Chancellor, and Emperor was designed to provide him with the time, safety, security, and resources to pursue his actual goal, discovering the secrets of immortality? If we consider the enemies removed along the way and the ability to now spend the wealth of Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic, the galaxy in whatever ways he wanted, we must wonder if Palpatine saw the Empire as a means to an end, the swiftest and easiest way, ensure that his will was enforced upon the galaxy so absolutely that he would be free to uncover the solution to eternal life without challenge or distraction. The knowledge that Palpatine was also a Sith Lord going by the name of Darth Sidious was probably one of the most closely guarded secrets in history. At some point in his time as Supreme Chancellor, he must have revealed his identity to the likes of Masameda and other bureaucrats and officials who would later go on to effectively run the empire. We can only be sure that those who continued to serve accepted this information and kept the secret. Many who were repulsed by it likely did not live much longer, and it may be worth a more detailed examination of officials who worked with Palpatine over the years, but then either faded into obscurity or unexpectedly passed away. The recent war, I am aware of the extent to which discussions about the Force, the Jedi, and the Sith can come to sound increasingly implausible. Even before I had spent years researching and uncovering the historical ruins and material left behind by generations of Sith. Among these remains, I have encountered stories of powers and prophecies that stretch the very limit of credulity. But I have also seen things that I cannot rationally explain without accounting for the existence of the Force. During an archaeological dig on Yoturba, I believe I saw the remnant of a long dead Sith Lord take control of one of my colleagues. I saw Luke Skywalker use the Force to levitate him clean off the ground. Both Luke Skywalker and Rey have given detailed accounts of their own encounters with Emperor Palpatine. Both mention how he could shoot lightning from his fingertips, how he could move things with his mind, how he claimed to be able to view the future. Many of these stories are supported by testimonials from ex-Imperials. And if these stories about are true, if he could do these things, then the tales of the ancient Sith must also be reconsidered. Palpatine. Emperor Palpatine. I spent years chasing around the galaxy searching for sites of Sith activity or temples, where some few scant clues could be dug from the ground to illuminate a fraction of the mystery. This was all before Exegol. Excavating the temple here may take an entire generation. Never before have we found so much material relating to the Sith in a single place. It appears, given our preliminary surveys, that Palpatine had spent years, either before or after his death at Endor, gathering up relics from worlds that had previously been thought to be myths like Moraband, or Korriban, as it is referred to in Sith texts. Andromeda Pass. This wealth of material could prove to be revelatory to our understanding of the Sith and of Palpatine's life as a Sith Lord. As a historian, this is hugely exciting. We now stand on the verge of knowing more than we ever have on these topics, but we must also exercise caution. I have seen enough of Sith relics to know that they can be tremendously dangerous. Most forms of historical and archaeological research cannot be rushed, but that is particularly true in this case. There are plenty of Sith legends which speak of ancient relics or weapons that will not just take a victim's life, but also their soul. At present, we know precious little about Palpatine's time learning under Darth Plagueis, and barely any more about how he trained his own apprentices, but there is a clear hope that this will soon be expanded clear from the earliest results of our survey on Exegol upon. It appears that, at various points, Palpatine had at least three Sith students: Darth Maul, Count Dooku, and Darth Vader 26. It is also clear that Palpatine had no qualms in dispensing with his students should circumstances dictate or better opportunities arise. According to these records, Maul was taken from his people on Dathomir at a young age and spent years learning from Palpatine, but following his defeat on Naboo, he was, although presumed dead for some time, discarded. Maul had been a 26 Exegol excavation project, section, Sith Lords Files, Darth Maul, Darth Tyrannus, and Darth Vader, all details retrieved from the Arcane Library. Star Wars, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Ferocious warrior, but he did not have the charisma or leadership skills that would be necessary to lead the Separatists. Dooku was a much better fit for that role. However, Dooku would also be tossed aside once he had fulfilled his purpose in favor of Anakin Skywalker, who was both younger and possessed significantly more power potential. What did Palpatine want to use that power for? Vader, as will be discussed, would often operate as the Emperor's roving enforcer. But this was after the severe injuries that left him encased in foreboding armor and dramatically weakened as a result. Palpatine may have nominally adhered to the Sith rule of two, a directive which ensured that there could only ever be a pair of Sith lords in existence, a master and an apprentice. But I find it unlikely he wanted to train Skywalker so he could be overthrown. My previous research into the ancient lore of both the Jedi and the Sith often found references to a prophesied individual. The Jedi called him the Chosen One, while fragments of Sith writings make mention of the coming of the Sithari. Both of these legends share certain aspects and details regarding the coming of one who was born of the Force itself, and who would wield tremendous power. The Jedi believed this individual would bring balance to the Force, the Sith that they would lead them to glory. Prophecies are difficult things to decipher and are often more a matter of faith than of destiny. But it appears, both from tales within the Jedi Order in the last days of the Republic and from scrolls retrieved from Exegol, that both sides believed the individual in question to be Anakin Skywalker. Anakin was trained as a Jedi before falling to the dark side of the Force and adopting the identity of Darth Vader. If, as the story suggests, Anakin Skywalker was the Lurked Historical Institute Review, Volume 3119, article, Historical Examples and Implications of the Sith Rule of Two, by Beaumont Kin, in particular, see Rebel Alliance Archives, section, Ahsoka Tano, file P23 Reflections on the Jedi Order, and also Exegol Excavation Project, section, Sith Lords, files, Sith Airy Prophecy. This scroll appears to have been annotated by Palpatine. 20. Conceived purely by the Force, it seems plausible that Palpatine believed Anakin may have held the solution to a way of unnaturally extending his own life. While others ran the galaxy for him, Palpatine may well have spent his time and energies in communing with the dark side of the Force and undertaking a variety of Sith experiments. The facility that was constructed on Exegol and that appeared to bring him back from the dead was not constructed overnight. Palpatine must have been funneling incredible quantities of resources and trusted personnel into the operation. Such long-standing investment must have been coming from a place of fear that he may not crack the pathway to immortality in time. Palpatine had good cause to be afraid. No sooner had he declared himself emperor than the same day he was attacked by Grandmaster Yoda, the head of the recently destroyed Jedi Order, in the Senate building. 2-9. Though the two fought each other to a standstill, Palpatine must have realized how close to defeat he had come. This may also account for some of Palpatine's reclusiveness, a desire to never be that vulnerable again unless he was able to pick the battlefield. Which produces another strange quirk of Palpatine's personality, was remarkably willing to risk his own life at points if he deemed the potential rewards great enough or had foreseen that he would be successful. He allowed himself to be captured by General Grievous at the end of the Clone Wars, almost dying when the invisible hand crash-landed on Coruscant, and, while Emperor, he used himself as bait during a visit to Ryloth that brought a rebel group out of hiding. When each of these gambits worked, it helped shore up Palpatine's power. When one finally did not, it cost him everything. His plan to try and convert Luke Skywalker on the second Death Star while fighting in suit on Endor must rank as one of his most arrogant and foolhardy. The Dark Imperial Archives, Section Emperor Palpatine, File Jedi Assassination. Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Side had given Palpatine significant power. Both Luke Skywalker and Rey reflected upon their encounters with the Emperor and described him as terrifying. But, as noted at the beginning of this chapter, the dark side did not create Palpatine's ideas and persona, it just empowered him. Having already succeeded with Anakin Skywalker, Palpatine could not conceive of failing with Luke. Here again we see signs of the man who would take the rejection of the galaxy personally. Whether Palpatine believed he would be successful or simply could not countenance Luke's rejection is unknown, but he certainly did not anticipate Vader's. Luke Skywalker noted that, clasped by Darth Vader and hurled into a reactor shaft, the Emperor screamed in horror and fear. Betrayal by your own apprentice is the Sith way, and yet, clearly, Palpatine had not considered it a possibility. This should have been the end, and a fitting one for such a man. Sadly, we now know this was not the case. In time, we will attempt to discover more about how Palpatine returned to Exegol, but we should not let his resurrection distract us from his reality. We should not let the raw power of the dark side blind us to the fact that Palpatine, beneath it all, remained the same scared man he always had been. For all the pain and misery he caused and reveled in, he spent his life chasing immortality only to fail because of his own shortcomings. Twice. The regime he created has cast a shadow over all of us for too long. This chapter will not be the only point in this study where we discuss and explore the actions of the Emperor, but it was a necessary starting point. However, to really understand the regime that Palpatine created, we must look beyond him and come to understand the actions of those who drew authority and permission from Palpatine, but fairly if ever interacted with him. We must separate the Emperor from the Empire. Real Alliance Anjin. Section Luke Skywalker File. Debriefing. Chapter 2. The Clone Wars. Your galaxy has been split by 3 major conflicts within, at least for some species, living memory. Previously, the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War had been considered 2 different events. However, given what we have since learned about Palpatine's involvement with both conflicts and the more recent First Order to Resistance War perhaps, it is better to think of them as key markers within a longer period of galactic warfare. It seems that many of the worst things that have happened to the galaxy across most of the last century can be attributed to Palpatine and the empire he wished to create. Like many of the events of recent history, the Clone Wars have been taught and understood in very different ways since the conclusion of the conflict. The Empire went to great lengths to frame the war in a manner that fully justified Palpatine's decision to dispense with the Republic and usher in the new regime. The Empire was positioned not just as the natural outcome of the issues and problems inherent within the Republic, but also as a necessary intervention from the one man capable of saving the galaxy. For years, a very carefully constructed version of the Clone Wars was delivered to the galaxy by the Empire with the aim of justifying the totalitarian government that now ruled. More recently, the New Republic found itself caught between a desire to learn lessons from the past and the urge to move forward and leave the darkness. Decent story about the Chinware. Juan and all that Palpatine hoped to achieve without also knowing a great deal about the conflict that preceded in a galaxy in flames. It is never easy to deconstruct accepted facts about momentous events of the past. As time goes on, the rough edges of memory or worn away versions of it that appear to be widely shared across the population. The reaction is generally one of concern or suspicion. This is true of how the Clone Wars has come to be understood, and of greater importance, how alternative views of the conflict have been effectively suppressed to examining the war by beginning with accepting as simple truths. There is no single unified history of memory of the Clone Wars because it was written by the only side that actually won the Empire at the expense of the experiences of Republic and Separatist participants. While the purpose of this study is not to build a new and fully rounded understanding of the Clone Wars, I hope it can serve as a starting place for all an endeavor in the future. The basic facts of the Clone Wars are well established, but given the length of time since the conflict's conclusion, still bear repeating. The Clone Wars. It is largely accepted that the origins of the war can be found in the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo was ostensibly over taxation in the Outer Rim. Though that blockade would eventually fail, following the involvement of the Jedi Order, it helped lay the seeds of the coming conflict, the fall of the Republic, and the rise of the Empire. The Trade Federation had previously achieved a great deal of power within the Republic Senate, but following their failure at Naboo, their fortunes dramatically fell. While enduring a form of political exile, they found like minded allies among other super conglomerate corporations and worlds across the Outer Rim. While these companies feigned neutrality within the Republic, in reality, they made clear their potential allegiance to the emerging Separatist alliance, planets who had long believed that the Republic scarcely functioned as a governing body, and certainly was not serving their planetary or commercial interests. While it would be these worlds who would provide much of the political momentum for the forthcoming secession, their industrial backers prepared for war and cynically profit. What this movement lacked was a leader, and soon enough one emerged in the form of Count Dooku. A former Jedi, Dooku had left the Order citing grave concerns with how the Jedi and the Republic were failing the galaxy. He provided the charisma and political leadership that the separatist movement required. Following a series of attempted but failed negotiations between the two sides, warfare broke out at the planet Geonosis and spread across the galaxy. The conflict would rage for years and see whole star systems ravaged before finally ending in defeat for the Separatists. While these details sketch out the broadest strokes of the Clone Wars, they do not fully explain the underlying tensions and machinations of the conflict, and nor do they really explain why it ended in the manner it did and what it meant for the dawn of the Galactic Empire. Wars are complicated things, In order to understand the Clone Wars, it is necessary to accept one fact that seems contradictory, but is also incredibly simple. Despite seeming to be one and the same, the Republic and Palpatine were writing very different wars with very different objectives. That is why Palpatine won and the Republic asked. The Trade Federation did not just pick Naboo at random to stage their initial blockade. They did so because they were urged to by a Sith Lord named Darth Sidious after that blockade failed. They and the rest of the separatist movement were led down a path to war aboard the same individual. What they and the Republic along with them failed to realize was that Sidious and Palpatine were the same person. While the Supreme Chancellor led the Republic, his Sith Lord persona with his apprentice Count Dooku orchestrated the Separatists, and beneath it all Palpatine made his own plans to achieve his goals. None of them included the success of the separatist movement of the long-term survival and stability of the Republic. As a result, the various military campaigns and battles of the Clone Wars, while of definite interest to military historians in seeing how the commanders and soldiers of both sides waged the war, are effectively irrelevant to this study. Though there was very real danger to those involved in fighting the war, there was no real jeopardy involved for Palpatine himself, as he was going to win regardless. Instead, we should focus our attentions on the moves and decisions that were taken to herald the Age of Empire that Palpatine had always intended. Within these plans and schemes, we can see the actual lasting impact of the Clone Wars on both sides that were supposedly fighting it, preparing the way. The underlying tensions and issues that had beset the Republic in the lead up to war must have been of great interest to Palpatine. They proved. Imperial Archives, Rection, Rise Trade Federation Records, File Natu Bohaid. This material was heavily censored and sealed during the era of the Empire and was only recured in the years after the war. The Clone Wars. That there was already significant demand for a change in the way the galaxy was governed. Beyond this, even if just in localized factions, there was also significant willingness to fight for that change, with both the Republic and the Separatists effectively viewing the war as a necessary one to preserve their very existence. Palpatine and Dooku would just have to ensure that neither side won it too quickly, nor felt motivated to sue for peace. The war weariness of the galactic population would be a crucial factor in its acceptance of the new regime. And Palpatine himself had to be welcomed, eventually, as a savior. Which is why it was so important that most of the political controls that he planned on keeping had to, publicly at least, appear forced upon him. Palpatine had to play the role of a reluctant figure grappling to end a conflict that was constantly spiraling out of control. For one of the primary purposes of this war was to brutalize the population of the galaxy. Palpatine knew that desire for change was not enough on its own. Peaceful movements might lead to an election or a change in the organization of the Republic, but neither of these things would upend the system, effectively leaving Palpatine in a position at the top. To achieve this, the population, both of the Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems, had to be made to suffer the realities of a war raging around them. This war had to be more destructive, more chaotic, more disruptive, and more horrifying than they could have believed. It had to have effects and impacts that were keenly felt both in the core and in the outer rim. Civilians had to die in huge numbers on besieged worlds. Property had to be destroyed. Economies had to collapse. Planets had to starve. The people of the Republic had to fully invest in Palpatine as a hope for peace, while the civilians on separatist worlds had to question whether independence was worth the. This can be seen in recordings of Palpatine's speech upon being granted emergency powers shortly before the Battle of Geonosis, available at Imperial Archives, Section, Emperor Palpatine, File T-271 and New Republic Archives. Section Galactic Republic File XS-409 Star Wars The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Horror. Because when Palpatine was ready to bring about the end of the conflict, both populations had to be so desperate for that moment that they would gratefully embrace peace. They must be so grateful that they would not care about the price it came at or what was traded away to achieve it. And Palpatine intended to charge a very high price for the end of his war. In many ways, this was the true target of the Clone Wars. It was not clone troopers against droid armies or loyalists against separatists. It was the use of weapons of war against the spirit and the morale of ordinary civilians. People needed to be led right up to the edge of disaster so that they would give anything to go back the way they had come, without noticing that the landscape had changed around them in the interim. In this sense, it was important that the war should, at least on the surface, end with a Republic victory. Most of the population involved with the war had continued to operate under the Republic. Palpatine was already installed as leader of that faction. In the earliest years of stabilizing the Empire, at the period when it was most vulnerable, it was important that people accepted it as the natural evolution of the war's end. In short, many civilians did not object to the changes going on around them because the Empire arrived wearing, initially at least, similar clothes to the Republic that had existed before. This level of acceptance was invaluable in securing the Empire's control across the galaxy. What? The Clone Wars posed a liability to the Empire that replaced it. Planets with a history of armed resistance could not be left to their own devices for long. Key systems such as Raxus Secundus, the capital of the Separatists, and Sereno, Count Dooku's homeworld, were the targets of early and brutal imperial occupation in order to stamp out any last surviving flames of insurrection. Palpatine needed the spirit that had driven the Separatists into open warfare to be crushed as quickly as possible. But having the specter of secession linger in the galaxy was also useful. The Empire was able to justify many of its early expansions and actions in the name of eliminating surviving holdouts from the Clone Wars, whether the targets actually had any relationship with the Separatists or not. The wider population was happy to accept such military endeavors in the name of safeguarding the seemingly hard-won peace. There were other benefits for the Empire arising from activities and actions undertaken during the previous war. Early in the conflict, the Republic had come to an arrangement with the Hutt cartel regarding access to hyperlanes and trade routes into the Outer Rim. These were hugely useful to Republic fleets during the conflict, as it granted them new pathways into contested territory that circumvented separatist blockades. The true value of these new routes, however, was not to the Republic, but to the Empire. Along the Outer Rim, there were any number of worlds and systems who had remained untouched or inaccessible to the Republic and fiercely guarded their independent status. Now they were within reach of an empire that cared little for and respected less the desires of star systems to maintain their own sovereignty. Following the conclusion of the Clone Wars, as will be discussed in a forthcoming chapter, the first waves of imperial expansion focused on those worlds who had remained neutral in the previous conflict, but now found themselves living alongside the borders of a belligerent neighbor. Former separatist worlds that had been converted into industrial hubs in order to fight the war were also welcome prizes for the Empire. The droid factories of the Trade Federation, Factoid Industries, and the Techno Union all now fell under imperial control. The leadership of these companies was purged, but the machinery and the industrial opportunities they provided were swiftly nationalized in service to the empire in a process called imperialization. Similarly, The huge stashes and collections of weaponry abandoned by the separatists at the end of the war would swiftly be claimed by the Empire, who would later find inventive uses for it. Beyond the material benefits of the war and the damage it did to the wider galactic population, there was an extra important and overarching objective for Palpatine in the way he waged it. The events of the Great Jedi Purge have become confused and complicated over time. Imperial propaganda pushed very clear messages about the Jedi, while at the same time making clear to the average citizen how important it was for them to forget about the Order and leave the topic very well alone. It should therefore not be surprising that the actual details of the events that saw the extermination of the Jedi and the conclusion of the Clone Wars remain largely uncertain. Hopefully, we can start to illuminate some of the events from here. Destruction and legacies. The roots of the Jedi's downfall lay in the creation of the clone army itself. In the lead up to the beginning of the war, the Republic Senate had been paralyzed with debates over the creation of a military force through which to defend itself against the emerging threat of the Separatists. Seemingly from nowhere, such an armed force was discovered in the form of a clone army created under contract by the Kaminoans. The exact series of events behind the creation of this army remains unclear, and records relating to it are scarce. The popularly accepted, the Clone Wars. The time was that a rogue Jedi by the name of Sifo Dyas had independently contacted the Kaminoans 10 years before the war to place the order for the clone troops. Given what we now know, and what should be shortly discussed, it seems highly unlikely that Sifo Dyas did this without at least some form of involvement or manipulation by Palpatine or his agents. The arrival of the clones at the exact moment they were required is far too convenient for there not to have been a long-running plan behind their creation. As part of the training and creation of these clone soldiers, each one was inserted with a piece of organic technology generally referred to as an inhibitor chip. These chips were ostensibly designed to ensure that the clones would only follow legitimate orders, but within their programming also lay various contingency plans for the clones to react to. Should various disasters befall the Republic war effort, only the Supreme Chancellor could issue these select orders, and as we know, Palpatine was assumed to be working in the Republic's best interests, and therefore would not do anything to damage the state. A very dangerous and misplaced assumption, because within these set directives was one titled Order 66. It was to be issued should the Jedi turn against the Republic and need to be eliminated. Ever since the clone army had arrived to rescue the Jedi on Geonosis at the outbreak of the war, much of the Republic's propaganda efforts had been designed to elevate and venerate the actions of these. Information regarding some of this background was provided to the Rebel Alliance by the former Jedi Ahsoka Tano while serving in her role of Fulcrum, a Rebel coordinating agent. Rebel Alliance Archives Section, Ahsoka Tano, File H33, Reflections on the Clone Army. For a full list of these various codes and their corresponding orders, see Imperial Archives, Section, Galactic Republic Military Operations, File PG-004 Executive Order Codes for the Grand Army of the Republic. Details of the inhibitor chips and their functions for the clone army have survived in selected Imperial archives. Additional information is drawn from testimonies by the clone captain known as Rex within Rebel Alliance records. Rebel Alliance Archives, Section, Clone Army, File XD 461, Rex. Soldiers. Images such as Support the Boys in White and Buy Republic War Bonds place the image of the clone trooper right at the forefront of the public's mind. A monument enshrining the identifying numbers of clone soldiers who had died on Geonosis was unveiled on Coruscant to commemorate their sacrifice to the Republic. The Jedi were, despite serving as generals and commanders in the war, relegated to the sidelines. During the war, the Republic instituted a program of population observation, where ordinary civilians would be regularly surveyed for their opinions on a range of aspects regarding the war effort. The Reacher ring fund as the war dragged on and became more destructive was the extent to which the Jedi were viewed as either a part of the problem or culpable for the conflict. As the war continued and suffering spread throughout the Republic, many, especially on Coruscant, came to look at the Jedi Temple and its occupants with resentment. If the Jedi were so powerful, how had they failed to win the war? If they were so wise, how had they not foreseen the coming dangers? If they were so important to the Republic, why were so many new clones required? With no obvious forthcoming answer to these questions, anger and distrust continued to blossom. Palpatine must have been delighted. His planned eradication of the Jedi would only be truly successful if the population either already hated them or did not care about their fate. The Separatists had spent much of the war creating their own propaganda warning about the Jedi menace, so that side of things was already taken care of. Palpatine just had to ensure that the population of the Republic was prepared to do without the Jedi Order. Following the failed attack on Coruscant by the Separatist fleet that cost Count Dooku his life, Palpatine, who almost certainly Orches, traded the whole thing, including his own staged abduction. The Clone Wars. Have decided that the end of the war was now approaching. The Jedi Order had supposedly been hunting for the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, who was orchestrating the war from behind the scenes. It seems logical that, given the attempt to arrest Palpatine in his offices, the Jedi had discovered his true identity. The failure to arrest him triggered the final stages of the war. From his offices, Palpatine must have transmitted a short statement to the clone army, Execute Order 66. On countless worlds, clone soldiers who had spent years living and fighting alongside the Jedi instantly turned on them. On Coruscant itself, a battalion of clones led by Anakin Skywalker, newly dubbed as Darth Vader, stormed the Jedi Temple and executed the occupants. From masters to younglings, none were spared. By the time the clones stopped firing, the Jedi had effectively been exterminated. The extinction of the Jedi removed a serious obstacle to Palpatine's plans. He must have known that if an organized Jedi Order remained, they would continuously oppose him. Their deaths became a necessity for his empire to live. It would not take long for the symbols of the Clone Wars and the Republic to be actively dismantled by the Empire. Imperial forces soon destroyed Tipoca City, the center for the Republic's cloning facilities in Camino. Imperial involvement in this act was only later exposed by a senator, with the blame being ascribed to a rogue vice admiral named Edmund Rampart, though it is hard to believe he had truly gone rogue and was not acting under the orders of senior officials. Regardless of his motivations, Rampart's actions helped bring about dramatic changes in the Empire's military. The end of the war had also brought about an effective end to the long-term viability of the clone army. As will be discussed in a forthcoming chapter, various figures within the Imperial military, including Grand Moff Tarkin, came to view the clones as an expensive and unnecessary undertaking for the Empire. Growing and training them took time and resources that could potentially be put to better use elsewhere. Furthermore, there were lingering concerns regarding the true loyalties of the clones. While many continued to serve in the armed forces of the Empire much as they had with the Republic, there were others who appeared changed by their time spent with the Jedi. The Empire had no interest in maintaining an army that may have been corrupted by exposure to the Order. they would shortly be phased out in favor of the new Stormtrooper program. One curiosity that did continue into the Empire was the emergence of amateur historical reenactments of key Clone Wars battles, complete with costumed clone troopers and demilitarized droids. There were groups across the core worlds who indulged in the practice and, strangely given their reputation for pacifism, a particularly strong presence for it existed on Alderaan. Why the Empire tolerated such overt harking back to the Republic and its obsolete symbols is perhaps on the surface unclear. There were some Imperial officials who believed that the Clone Wars reenactment movement provided young persons with the military skills and training that would be invaluable for service in the Empire, though whether this viewpoint was widely held is uncertain. It is noticeable that this was one of the few ways in which imagery and uniforms from the Republic were permitted within civilian life. Again, this might seem unusual, but when you remember that the Republic that gave way to the new regime had already been through a period of militarization, it becomes a much more understandable evolution. The Republic that existed in the latter stages of the Clone Wars was not the example of peace and prosperity that had once existed. It was not a great leap to go from the Republic venerating the military during the Clone Wars to the Empire using it as cover to expand its armed forces while celebrating them at the same time. The annual Empire Day parades, which were a feature on many worlds, celebrated the end of the Clone Wars as well as the dawn of the Imperial State. The major difference between how the Republic and the Empire viewed the Clone Wars was the removal of all references to the Jedi, often in favor of a greater acknowledgement of Palpatine. Many of the participants of the reenacted scenes were from the upper classes of the core worlds may also provide an explanation as to why it was permitted. The Empire would often allow the wealthy to create their own diversions and entertainment as long as they were not using their resources for things that actively undermined the Empire. There was, however, one significant holdover from the transition between Republic and Empire that continued to hold a deal of power and significance. While the Empire wished to sweep away many of the trappings and systems of the failed Republic, the aftermath of a Werevin one that had served its purpose was difficult. For the Empire to have a long-term future, it needed to solidify its hold over the galaxy, shore up its power, and survive the tumultuous aftermath of the conflict. To achieve this, the Empire maintained the existence of the most obvious relic of the Republic, the Senate. In order to understand how the Empire intended to organize and rule the galaxy, we must also understand the ways in which it accepted or circumvented limits on its political power. Chapter 3: The Imperial Senate. E. The continued existence of the Senate as one of the enduring elements of the now fallen Republic that carried over into the Galactic Empire has previously provoked a good deal of confusion among those studying the Imperial State. This is understandable. If we accept that Palpatine intended to reign over the galaxy as a dictator, retaining a publicly elected body that had some powers to thwart his plans seems counterproductive. However, this confusion often overlooks the fact that the Empire's control was not instantaneous. It was an, at times, incremental progression away from the Republic following the Clone Wars. While Palpatine may have wanted to dispense with the Senate entirely, the fact that it took years to be able to do so is instructive as to how secure he and his primary advisors felt in the Empire's stability. That will become apparent as this study progresses. Palpatine and Grand Moff Tarkin alongside him had a very definite endpoint in mind for the Senate. Furthermore, as will also become apparent as we progress, the upper echelons of the Empire were often creative in solving significant obstacles in their path. There is certainly evidence to suggest that the Senate was not simply a powerless body, but an institution that did have the power to directly impact imperial plans and activities. While its eventual dissolution was the inevitable end stage of Palpatine's plans, this would take time. Before this point could be reached, the Empire would. Star Wars, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, have to find ways of dealing with this political body. Though they could attempt to circumvent its reach and oversight, this was not always possible. The solution to this issue was as inventive as it was cynical. Rather than continually try and dance around the Senate, the Empire took a different approach, one it would repeat at various levels for other administrative and military personnel and organizations. That is, the Empire wove the Senate into the decision making processes for some of its most unsavory crimes, rather than allow the politicians to stand apart from the grim reality of imperial rule. The Empire sought, as this chapter will outline, to make sure they were also culpable. Maintaining the balance. There has been a tendency, as already mentioned in this study, to idealize the Senate of the Republic, to view it at the time of its fall through the lens of its highest moments. Histories of the admittedly long gone era, now collectively referred to as the High Republic, have noted how the state aimed to be a unifying force, and that slogans such as "We are all the Republic" and "For light and life" motivated both the ordinary citizenry and the Jedi to move the galaxy forward. A few of these studies have overlooked some of the growing problems within the High Republic. Though idealism can form a powerful bond, the motives and directives of individual senators were a source of potential erosion. Similarly, that government's response to aggression from a pirate group known as the Nihil was initially, at least, less than impressive and significant. Civilian casualties were sustained before the situation was brought under control. However, what can be taken from this period of history is that the galaxy and its various institutions could still be rallied together against an emerging menace. There remained a desire to try and improve both the Republic and the galaxy, and the system of government allowed for those efforts to be undertaken. However, the final 100 or so years of the Republic were the Imperial Senate, a far cry from the ideals that had gone before. The Senate that existed during the last years of the Republic had fallen a very long way from those lofty heights. The sad irony of the Republic's fall is that it came at a time when some of the most capable and idealistic politicians for a generation were attempting to prevent the unfolding collapse. The likes of Mon Mothma are, of course, legendary for their leadership of the Rebel Alliance and then the New Republic. There is a reason why her life and career are considered key parts of school education. Similarly, before his death during the destruction of Alderaan, Senator Bail Organa had been a key figure in opposing Palpatine. During the Clone Wars, he joined with like-minded senators, including Padme Amidala from Naboo, in trying to derail some of the more egregious attempts to place additional power into Palpatine's hands. Following the declaration of the Empire, Organa then secretly worked with Mon Mothma and other allies to help found the Rebel Alliance. However, set alongside these figures were a variety of loyalist groups and factions that supported Palpatine's rule during the last years of the Republic for a mixture of personal and political reasons. When Palpatine's new empire was greeted with seemingly unanimous consent in the Senate chamber, not all of those who cheered and applauded did so out of corruption or political expediency. There were those who had supported Palpatine during the war and voted him additional powers and controls because they believed he could be trusted with them. This is an important lesson for the galaxy moving forward. There will always be those who are prepared to accelerate the death of democracy if they believe power is being given to someone worthy. However, there was also potential danger for Palpatine within this situation. It was easy enough to rely on the support of those senators who had been bought or bribed or coerced into supporting him. They weren't going anywhere particularly, now that the Empire was unopposed. But support from those who chose to believe in him could be more precarious. Should those same senators be presented with evidence of atrocities, or grow aghast at decisions undertaken too quickly, they might start to turn on the emperor likes of Palpatine Mas. This required a careful balancing act by the Ameda and other political figures within the nascent empire, because underlying everything was the realization that regardless of what they may wish to achieve in the long term, following the end of the Clone Wars, the Empire needed the Senate. It could not hope to rule the galaxy without them. The war had done grave damage to wider galactic infrastructure, and the shift to Empire did not immediately translate into fully centralized power. Therefore, if the Empire was going to function and at some future point dispense with the Senate entirely, it was necessary to make use of them as an organizational and administrative body for as long as required. As a result, very little of the actual process and responsibilities of the Senate initially changed as the Republic gave way to the Empire. The Republic had already allowed member worlds to effectively define their own electoral procedures and the limits of their senators' terms of office. While Galactic Standard Time was used across both the Republic and the Empire, trying to legislate for a senatorial standard. Across thousands of worlds with differing orbital cycles and species lifespans was an impossible task. So, each member system generally produced a representative through whichever means and methods best worked for them. Given that this system ensured that Mon Mothma continued to represent Shanvila and Bail Organa did the same for Alderaan, it might seem perplexing that the Empire did not actively involve themselves in the electoral process to ensure that more favorable candidates were successful. Both Mothma and Organa Islands, while the Imperial Senate, they were on Coruscant. Though the surviving Imperial Security Bureau files on Mon Mothma proved how difficult it was to pin any truly seditious or criminal activities on Hen, save for repeated mention of non-political infractions committed by her husband. It would certainly have made life easier for the Empire in the long run if both Mothma and Organa had been removed before the rebellion spread too far. But perhaps this also misunderstands the imperial plans for the Senate. There were undoubtedly any number of senators serving within it that were nuisances in some way or another. But the benefit of having them all operate on Coruscant was that it made it easier to keep track of them, rather than trying to maintain surveillance on all their homeworlds. If any of them did become a serious issue, there were various means through which they could be arrested on corruption charges or something similarly convoluted that would tarnish their name back home while also removing them as an obstacle. Traditionally, as we now know, the Empire did not view the Senate as a long term proposition. Senators would continue to serve for as long as Palpatine deemed it necessary and not a moment longer. But while they were there, they could provide a significant service to the Empire, not through serving the various constituents and maintaining the smooth running of the state. That was largely expected, and in the sectors the Empire was intending to expand into or take direct control of, largely irrelevant to the current moment. Instead, what the senators could do, especially those viewed as potentially problematic, would be forced into scenarios where they would have to dirty their hands with imperial crimes and misadventures. In this way, they would deflect any blame away from the emperor and onto themselves. Wielding power. There is sometimes a tendency to overlook the political experience Palpatine gained through his years of work in the Republic Senate. His understanding of the ebbs and flows of political fortunes and how best to achieve the results he wanted was invaluable in now managing the Imperial Senate. Leia Organa once spoke about how Mon Mothma had explained the ways Palpatine would lay traps for senators that would force them into doing his bidding by accident. Leia Organa herself was the victim of several of these attempts while she was serving in the apprentice legislature and learning the ways of imperial politics. The apprentice legislature was, in principle, a program designed to allow the politicians and administrators of the future the chance to learn the methods and bureaucracy of governing the galaxy while they were younger. In reality, though, many worlds ceased to send representatives to participate, and the Empire had come to view the system as an easy way to drag young volunteers into various forms of culpability before they'd even been elected into office. A prime example, according to Leia Organa's own records, was the decision by her cohort of the apprentice legislature to select the planet Ariel instead of three other options to be the home of a planned Imperial Academy of Aeronautical Engineering and Design. The decision was made because of how the Academy could benefit Ariel's economy and populace. However, following Imperial scans of the planet, a significant radiation source was discovered and the world was seized by Imperial authorities. As punishment for having never declared the radiation source, the inhabitants were given a matter of weeks to evacuate with no compensation. Leia Organa, almost certainly correctly, reflected that the entire process had been a ruse designed to allow those scans to take place and discover the radiation source that the Empire already, the Imperial Senate, suspected was there. Out of a desire to do good, Leia Organa and her compatriots had been tricked into furthering the Empire's aims. Leia Organa, along with the likes of Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, learned that there were very few ways in which any form of sustained ethical choices could be made while operating under Palpatine's rule. If decisions were put before committees or raised as bills and amendments on the Senate floor, they were often liable for alteration or manipulation by imperial political advisors or governors to create the outcome they desired, while also smearing the reputations of those senators who had been the driving forces. So complicated was the process of navigating the various pitfalls of imperial politics that Senator Dao Sejan once wrote to a compatriot that the Senate increasingly resembles a rigged casino. Given that Palpatine always wins the political games, it seems pointless to play unless you can also secure your own prizes at the same time. Stajan was later executed for some unspecified form of treason, so it appears that he did not end up playing the game well enough. Records of the decisions taken by the Senate, records that the Empire itself made sure were well preserved and dispersed to the relevant worlds, are replete with examples of senators signing off on decisions that then had widespread negative effects. Campaigns to help the starving population of Wabani resulted in the planet being converted into a prisoner and labor camp, thereby providing accommodation and food for those trapped there. A bill requesting additional employment opportunities in Corellia led to the shipyards becoming an associated offshoot of Kuat Dry Yards to help construct new star destroyers. The result for the inhabitants of the planet was heavy pollution in the upper atmosphere. For everyone else, it was the growing shadow of star, suspected was there. Out of a desire to do good, Leia Organa and her compatriots had been tricked into furthering the Empire's aims. Leia Organa, along with the likes of Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, learned that there were very few ways in which any form of sustained ethical choices could be made while operating under Palpatine's rule. If decisions were put before committees or raised as bills and amendments on the Senate floor, they were often liable for alteration or manipulation by imperial political advisors or governors to create the outcome they desired, while also smearing the reputations of those senators who had been the driving forces. So complicated was the process of navigating the various pitfalls of imperial politics that Senator Dao Sejan once wrote to a compatriot that the Senate increasingly resembles a rigged casino. Given that Palpatine always wins the political games, It seems pointless to play unless you can also secure your own prizes at the same time. Sejin was later executed for some unspecified form of treason, so it appears that he did not end up playing the game well enough. 5. Records of the decisions taken by the Senate records that the empire itself made sure were well preserved and dispersed to the relevant worlds are replete with examples of senators signing off on decisions that then had widespread negative effects. Campaigns to help the starving population of Wobani resulted in the planet being converted into a prisoner and labor camp, thereby providing accommodation and food for those trapped there. A bill requesting additional employment opportunities on Corellia led to the shipyards becoming an associated offshoot of Quat Drive Yards to help construct new star destroyers. The result for the inhabitants of the planet was heavy pollution in the upper atmosphere. For everyone else, it was the growing shadow of star. Organa, personal writings, lessons from serving in Palpatine's Senate. Imperial Archives, Section, Senator Daho Sejan, File Z14 Seed Records. Imperial Senate Proceedings, File VK 139.5. Imperial Senate Proceedings, File DL 221.8. Destroyers in orbit above their worlds. Shortly after the empire was founded, Senator Ryo Chuchi of Pantora was a strong dissenter against the planned Imperial Defense Recruitment Bill that would seek to phase out the clone army and replace them with civilian soldiers recruited or conscripted from the wider population. The bill had already been defeated once before but had been returned to the Senate again. Senator Chuchi garnered opposition to the bill from existing clone soldiers and then exposed the destruction of Tipoca City and its cloning facilities on the orders of Vice Admiral Rampart, who was the bill's main supporter, on the floor of the Senate. Rampart was immediately arrested as a response. Chuchi and her allies may have briefly thought that they had won the debate, but the sudden arrival of Emperor Palpatine changed all of this. He expressed his concerns that Rampart's clone soldiers had obeyed the order to attack Camino without hesitation, and that such blind loyalty represented a threat to the Empire, something that a conscript stormtrooper army would not. In response, the Senate enthusiastically supported the bill, and Chuchi discovered that she had been outmaneuvered all along. Because of the ongoing fear that any action would be twisted to either support the empire or result in senators being held responsible as culpable participants in ongoing imperial activity. Many of them found themselves effectively paralyzed by indecision. When faced with several, even seemingly contradictory options, fear that all of them somehow served Palpatine prevented lawmakers from acting decisively or indeed at all. This did nothing to remove the reputation of the Senate as a body that achieved nothing but talking, with only imperial governors seemingly able to act without the obstacles of politics. Amid this indecision, various unscrupulous politicians took the decision to simply accrue their own personal wealth and power at the expense of their home systems, given that little could be done to assist them anyway. The Imperial Senate. Mernfree Ta had been the senator for Ryloth since the Republic, and had been a staunch loyalist of Palpatine during the Clone Wars. During the reign of the Empire, he continued his role in the Imperial Senate and was willing at various points to impede and threaten the Free Ryloth movement on his home planet, viewing its leader Shamsin Dula as a political rival who threatened his own position and wealth. Bill Franking served for a time as the senator for Lothal, but seemingly spent most of his time gathering additional wealth through a variety of corrupt deals with regional industry and trying to block the fortunes of political rivals like Governor Arinda Price. His avarice and political machinations eventually came to an end when Governor Price was able to have him implicated in a bribery scandal. There were also other ways for imperial senators to prove their loyalty to the empire while also being complicit in some of its most cynical crimes. In the years before the Battle of Yavin, Gall Travis, the imperial senator for Ostfrill, resigned from his position and began to garner a reputation as a wanted dissident through a series of covert broadcasts criticizing the empire. Seemingly in an attempt to build up an organized rebellion, he made contact with various groups across the galaxy who were resisting the empire. However, following an encounter with the rebel cell on Lothal, it was discovered that his persona was nothing more than a facade organized in conjunction with the Imperial Security Bureau ISB. Travis had retained his loyalty to the Empire and had been working to identify rebel groups across the galaxy so they could be rounded up by Imperial forces. Following the conclusion of the Galactic Civil War, Travis was put on trial by the New Republic, where evidence was presented that he had been complicit in the imprisonment and deaths of hundreds of beings from across the galaxy. 12. Because of Palpatine's scheming and the tendency of some senators to choose corruption over actual service, it would be easy to assume that the Senate had very little actual power or ability to intervene in galactic affairs. But that is not entirely true. Before my first mission against the First Order, I had a prolonged conversation with General Leia Organa. I told her that I was not really a soldier and merely an academic. I told her that I was afraid. She smiled and told me that when she was captured on the Tantive IV with the Death Star plans, she had also been afraid, but despite the fact she was a prisoner, she'd stood before Darth Vader and told him that she was on a diplomatic mission and that the Imperial Senate would not accept his attack on her vessel. She meant this story to reassure me about bravery in the face of fear, but I also took something else from it. If you are going to threaten Darth Vader with something, it must be something he might be afraid of. If the Senate truly had no power, why did Leia use this line of defense? One of the last recorded actions of the Imperial Senate was to receive the notification of a distress signal from the Tantive IV and the additional details that all aboard had been killed. This is clearly not what happened. So, again, if the Senate posed no threat to the Empire, why lie to it? The Senate had also only recently been informed that Jeddah City had been destroyed in a mining accident rather than by the Death Star. This was also a lie, and if the Senate was an irrelevance, seemingly an unnecessary one. We may have to reconcile ourselves to accepting the seemingly contradictory nature of the Imperial Senate as something that Palpatine was largely able to manipulate, but also an institution that could cause him significant problems. The Emperor did not maintain the Imperial Senate, body out of a sense of desire, but rather one of necessity. Until he could fully rule the galaxy as he chose, he had to walk the line between dictator and accountable political figure. While many of the controls and plans of the Senate could be circumvented, the senators could still cause problems if they overtly supported the burgeoning rebel alliance. Mon Mothma's speech denouncing Palpatine and his role in the massacre on Gorman was enough to send her fleeing into exile. But the Imperials would not have chased her so hard if they were not concerned about what her words might provoke. Similarly, the Imperial Senate was able to enforce limitations and restrictions on the Imperial military at various points. This included things like the mandatory completion of Imperial Naval Regulation 132 C, the TC-22 documents to justify any ship opening fire on an escape pod. The form was adopted by the Imperial Navy in response to Senate investigations into possible war crimes. The Senate was a multifaceted entity, and it is necessary to fully understand these different aspects of its operation in order to understand why the Emperor thought it necessary to first sustain it and then remove it. The solution, as previously established, during the early years of the Empire, The imperial senate was viewed by the likes of Palpatine and Masameda as a necessary inconvenience which they aimed to manipulate and circumvent where possible. Palpatine maintained a veto over laws passed in the Senate, but, in the interests of maintaining the careful balance with the legislature, would allow some policies into law even if they provided an obstacle to his current plans. The senators who opposed Palpatine seemed to believe that, given enough time, they could prevent too much damage being inflicted upon the galaxy. As noble as this viewpoint was, at least some of them did not recognize the precarity of their situation. Palpatine viewed the Senate as a temporary nuisance, not a permanent or long-term one. The moment he no longer needed it, the body would cease to exist. The roots of the Senate's eventual obsolescence lay in the restructuring of the galaxy through appointed regional governors and moffs who would regulate and administrate different sectors and star systems. The Senate initially opposed these measures when they were first floated in the Republic toward the end of the Clone Wars, but Palpatine and Grand Moff Tarkin were able to achieve the same result over an extended period, as they gradually diverted much of the day-to-day administration of the imperial state out of the hands of elected politicians and into those of loyal officers. With this administration now solidified under imperial control, the Senate lost much of its actual power and relevance, and with the burgeoning rebel alliance gaining support among some senators, the political benefits of maintaining the body also began to erode. While this transfer of political power was underway, Palpatine and Tarkin had been secretly orchestrating the final stage of the plan to solidify imperial control across the galaxy. At the moment of its completion, Palpatine made his move. It can surely be no coincidence that within days of the Death Star being declared fully operational following its test firing at Jedha, and having been witnessed in action by the rebel fleet at Scarif, that Palpatine dissolved the Senate. The entirety of the Death Star project had, as will be discussed in greater detail in a forthcoming chapter, been kept secret and hidden from the eyes of the Senate. Funding and requisitions of equipment to enable the weapon's construction were diverted through various different systems and sectors, and were spread across so many different imperial accounts as to make it extremely difficult for even the most dedicated senator to discern what was happening. With the weapon completed, there was no need for any further secrecy. Palpatine's solution to the political body was ready, where the Senate had served to represent the voices of the population, even in a hobbled state, the Death Star, the Imperial Senate. Following the announcement of the dissolution of the Imperial Senate, it has long been supposed that many of its representatives were subject to immediate arrest warrants and incarceration. There is certainly evidence of some cases of this taking place. Senator Nadia Tural had served as a representative for Thrad and had, over time, come to be seen as a vociferous rebel sympathizer. She and several other rebel supporters were arrested and imprisoned in the Arth Eno prison complex, where they were subsequently executed. But the fate of Tural and her fellows was surprisingly rare. Some of the most ardent supporters of the rebel alliance were not even on Coruscant when the dissolution came, having already traveled to the Alliance headquarters on Yavin 4 to receive news of the Death Star's existence. The ordinary senators who had not sided with the Rebel Alliance were simply removed from office and then ignored. In the lead up to the dissolution of the Senate, full sessions had actually become incredibly rare. This was partly because of the aforementioned transfer of real power from the Politicians to imperial governors. But many outland senators often dispatched proxies or did not bother with the journey to Coruscant at all. Empty senatorial pods were an increasingly common sight. By the time of the dissolution, some senators had not been to Coruscant in months and simply stayed home. The Plain fact was that Palpatine and his administrators had barely cared about any of them individually when they had power, and he cared even less when they had none. The sudden destruction of Alderaan was enough to get the message across to these newly unemployed senators about what could happen to their worlds if they aimed to cause trouble. Many returned to their home systems, some eventually becoming contacts and agents for the rebels as the Galactic Civil War unfolded, while others sat back to watch with curiosity which side would triumph. Some even re-emerged in the New Republic Senate to lead their worlds again, the greatest irony being reserved for those who witnessed the Senate fall once more, this time in Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. Chapter 4: The New Order. While the Imperial Senate was, as has been discussed, nominally charged with orchestrating the political aspects of the empire, the actual administration of the newly formed state was managed from elsewhere. As with the Senate, certain aspects of bureaucracy and legal construction were adopted from the now disbanded Republic. This was partly because it was far easier and more convenient to adapt existing laws and infrastructure than create brand new ones immediately, but also to help avoid the transition being too dramatic for the galaxy's population, regardless of what the end goal of that transition might be. The structure of the empire, once the new regime was established, has always appeared to be a complicated collection of departments, organizations, and bureaus, often working at a cross purpose. Previous studies have wondered how the empire ever actually managed to achieve or organize anything, given the apparent tangle of authorities. However, I feel this position to be a misunderstanding of the very particular intentions and designs behind the imperial structure. There is something deeply ingenious about the way imperial officials organized. Indeed, most administrative recruits who entered the bureaucracy of the empire were provided with a copy of Chief Administrator Svete Naimon's gargantuan work, a thorough guide to the bureaucratic operation and diligent administration of the Galactic Empire, which, from my own research, was not an easy read. Those who would actually carry out orders and maintain the administration of Palpatine's empire, the myriad of advisors and officials who operated in the level below Palpatine, undertook a form of administrative triage to avoid bothering the Emperor with issues and decisions that were beneath his notice or would distract him from other matters. But, as we shall see in this chapter and in others, none of them had even remotely the power or authority to replace Palpatine at the top of the hierarchy. It was a system expressly designed for two purposes: to undertake the monumental task of administering the empire, and to solidify the rigidity of imperial structure. They called it the New Order, competition by design. When understanding the ways in which the various aspects of the empire came together to function, it is important for us to further accept something established in an earlier chapter. The emperor was the only one who could have the full authority of ruling the empire, while also having no interest in its day-to-day operation. Without understanding and accepting this aspect of the empire, it is not possible to fully recognize the nature of the imperial hierarchy and state apparatus. Huge amounts of energy and time were spent in weeding out almost all aspects of imperial bureaucracy, administration, and operation before they ever reached Palpatine's attention, therefore ensuring he would only ever have to interact with the specific projects and undertakings that interested him. The result of this was a system of hierarchy that placed the various arms and aspects of imperial governance into well-defined silos of influence and power. The purpose of these silos was to ensure that the various branches of the imperial machine would require each other to perform their own duties while simultaneously not having clear routes of interaction between them that would enable the circumventing of the overall system. For example, the imperial military relied upon funding to maintain operations, and pay the wages of soldiers. However, this funding was administered by the imperial bureaucracy and diverted out via Compnor, which we shall come to in more detail shortly. Planetary governors may have wished to have additional controls over military forces deployed in their regions, but the chain of command went up through the Grand Moffs and dedicated imperial advisors before it reached various military commands. Throughout this system, the opportunity to take shortcuts through proceedings is denied because the various institutions and bodies have no official means of contacting each other directly, and unofficial attempts to do so would quickly draw the attention of the relevant authorities. While at times of crisis or during moments of serious military concern, this rigid framework prevented imperial forces from reacting quickly to changes of circumstance. In every other way, it worked exactly as intended. No parts of the imperial state could circumvent the chain of command or, crucially, plot against the emperor without it becoming immediately apparent. In this way, any attempts at an organized coup were almost inevitably doomed to fail because of the warning signs that would be picked up by the systems and departments that had been bypassed. Furthermore, the desire to even attempt a coup